What became of Richard Winter's best friend, the hard-drinking Captain Lewis Nixon, after World War II? In Band of Brothers, Lewis Nixon, who is portrayed by actor Ron Livingston, is depicted as being a deeply loyal, sharp-witted alcoholic who expresses near constant indifference no matter the situation. The real Richard Winters said that Lewis Nixon was one of only two men who he never saw show fear in combat, the other being Ronald Spears. Of course, it's reasonable to conclude that this might have been in part due to the fact that Lewis Nixon was intoxicated much of the time, in addition to the fact that as a Battalion S2 or intelligence officer, he was seldom in the thick of battle. In fact, Lewis Nixon didn't fire his rifle a single time in combat during the war. To fully understand who Lewis Nixon was after World War II, it's important to first understand his life prior to the war. Lewis Nixon was born on September 30th, 1918 in New York City to Stanhope and Doris Nixon. He was one of three children. He had a younger brother named Fletcher, who was born in 1922 and sadly died when he was just 8 weeks old. His sister Blanche was born in 1923. Lewis Nixon grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. His family owned Nixon Nitration Works in New Jersey, a company that was founded in 1915 by his grandfather, naval architect and shipbuilder Lewis Nixon I. The company's main function was making gunpowder and other materials for European nations during World War I. In the years that followed the war, the company focused on manufacturing cellulose nitrate, the first man-made plastic, which was highly flammable. It was used in tubing for pencils and pens, covers for eyeglass frames, and sheets for playing cards. Such a business didn't come without risk. In 1924, a massive explosion rocked the factory, claiming the lives of 20 people and injuring approximately 100 others. 40 buildings were destroyed in the blast, which made up much of the tiny industrial town of Nixon, New Jersey, which is today Edison, New Jersey. The explosion could be felt in Brooklyn and 50 miles away in Mineola, New York. It became referred to as the Nixon Nitration Works disaster. There's even a Wikipedia page dedicated to it. The family rebuilt the company on the same site. Lewis Nixon spent his early childhood in both Manhattan and the family estate in New Jersey. When he was 12, the Nixons moved to an estate in Montecito, California, where he lived until adulthood. He graduated from the prestigious Cate School, a strict boarding school near Santa Barbara. He then attended Yale University for 2 years, studying engineering. He also took summer courses in engineering at MIT. He returned to work at Nixon Nitration Works before enlisting in the Army at Fort Dix, New Jersey on January 14, 1941. By that point, Lewis Nixon was a hard-drinking 22-year-old party boy who had already traveled across Europe, visiting England, France, and Germany. He even spent a year when he was 10 living in a villa that his family owned in France called Villa Falaise, which is located in the Côte d'Azur region. Years later, Lewis would inherit the villa and lease it to the Kennedy family in the 1950s. Newspaper reports reveal that he then tried to sell it in 1957. Lewis Nixon had come from a long history of military service. Up to and including his own service in World War II, his family members had fought in every war since the Revolution. In fact, he is a direct descendant of George Washington's Chief of Staff, General Andrew Lewis, an important figure in the Revolution and one of the founders of Richmond, Virginia. His great-grandfather, Colonel Lafayette Wood, fought in the Mexican War and the War of 1812. His grandfather, Lewis Nixon I, fought in the Spanish-American War, and his father, Stanhope Nixon, was a lieutenant in World War I. For Lewis, military service was almost a family rite of passage. Lewis Nixon completed basic training at Camp Croft in South Carolina. On December 20th, 1941, almost a year after he enlisted in the Army, he married Stanford graduate Catherine Page in New York City. The couple had a son, Michael, who was born on October 27, 1943, after Lewis had already embarked for England with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. As seen in Band of Brothers, Catherine later informed Lewis that she was divorcing him via a letter he received while he was still overseas in the war. In the episode Why We Fight, in a rare moment when he loses his cool, he tells his friend Richard Winters that she was taking everything, including the dog. In the Richard Winters biography, Biggest Brother, Winters said that when they were still stateside, he had been to Nixon's house many times and observed that there was no love in Nixon's married life. Winters then stated that Catherine was just interested in the Nixon millions, and Nix, as a result, lost all faith in women. His drinking was also cited as one of the reasons for their eventual divorce. Lewis Nixon and Richard Winters first met at Army Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning in the spring of 1942. They formed what would become a lifelong friendship. On the surface, the two couldn't be more opposite. Winters came from a middle-class family, while Nixon's extravagantly wealthy family rubbed elbows with William Randolph Hearst and the Kennedys. Nixon was an alcoholic who liked to hit the town, and Winters didn't drink at all and preferred to stay on the base. Winters explained their friendship in his memoir as follows: "Despite our differences in lifestyle, I sensed we shared mutual feelings and ways of looking at life. I could understand him and help him understand me, as well as understand himself. Our friendship evolved naturally, and he soon became my closest friend." Stephen Ambrose stressed that both men shared a dedication to proficiently executing their assignments as soldiers, and both were highly skilled in their roles. Ambrose stated the following in the Band of Brothers book: "Every member of Easy interviewed for this book said Winters was the best combat commander he ever saw, while Nixon was the most brilliant staff officer he knew in the war." In Richard Winters' memoir, Beyond Band of Brothers, he said that it was at Fort Benning that he knew Lewis Nixon trusted him immensely. "While we were in training before we shipped overseas, Nixon hid his entire inventory of VAT 69 blended whiskey in my footlocker, under the tray holding my socks, underwear, and sweaters. What greater trust, what greater honor could I ask for than to be trusted with his precious inventory of VAT 69? Lewis Nixon's reliance on alcohol grew worse during the war. Not long after Easy Company fought in the Battle of Carentan on June 12, 1944, Lewis Nixon was moved up from his role as 2nd Battalion Intelligence Officer, or S2, to become the Regimental Intelligence Officer for the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. However, over time, the commander of the 506th, Colonel Robert Sink, grew tired of Nixon's drinking and wanted to transfer him. It's accurate that Richard Winters convinced Colonel Sink to allow Nixon to remain in the 506th. Sink instead demoted Nixon from regimental staff back down to battalion staff in the spring of 1945. He would then serve directly under Winters as Operations Officer, or S3, and be mostly out of Sink's hair. It's true that Lewis Nixon had invited Richard Winters to come to New Jersey after the war was over to work for Nixon Nitration Works, the family business. Nixon returned home from Europe in September 1945. As noted at the end of Band of Brothers, Winters took Nixon up on the job offer, and within 2 weeks of Winters returning home, he traveled to New York City to meet Lewis Nixon's parents. It was then that Nixon's father offered Winters the job. Winters became personnel manager at Nixon Nitration Works, working under Lewis, and he was eventually promoted to general manager. Winters worked with Lewis at the company for a total of approximately 6 years, from January 1946 until December 1951. According to the Richard Winters biography, Biggest Brother, Winters wanted to quit because of the family drama, including Lewis's hard-drinking, womanizing father, Stanhope Nixon, once pointing a gun at him while drunk after Stanhope's mistress called Winters for help. Winters only planned to stay at the company until he found a new job. Around that same time, Winters was recalled to active duty for Korea. The recall gave Winters an excuse to step away from the company and the drama. Back on active duty, Winters served briefly as a regimental planning and training officer at Fort Dix, New Jersey. As emphasized in the series, he was given the last-minute option to resign from the Army, and he decided not to go to Korea. He'd had enough of war. He did try to return to Nixon Nitration Works in September 1952, but he discovered his position had been filled. Everyone had thought, even Winters himself, that he was going to Korea. It's possible Winters was only looking to return until he found another job. However, it doesn't seem that Lewis Nixon knew that, and it couldn't have been easy for him to have to tell his best friend that his role at the company had been taken. This might explain why Nixon gave Winters 6 months' pay and signed over the company car to him. Nixon felt bad that he was losing his best friend and wanted to help him stay on his feet until he could find a new job. By that point, Winters also had a wife and a 1-year-old son to support. Winters then went back to New Jersey and found a job as a production supervisor with Johnson & Johnson. He ultimately ended up in Pennsylvania, where he had bought a 106-acre farm and built a home there for his family. It is where he would eventually find the peace and quiet that he had promised himself on D-Day. Having read the stories of so many veterans who struggled with PTSD after the war and how they held so much of their pain inside, unable to talk about it with their families, it would be hard to overestimate how cathartic it must have been for Lewis Nixon and Richard Winters to have each other in their lives almost on a daily basis in the years immediately following the war. Even after Winters left Nixon's family's company and would eventually start his own animal feed business, we know from postcards and letters between the two men and their wives that they always remained good friends. Not all Easy Company veterans were as fortunate. Some returned home and lost touch with the men they'd fought alongside. They bottled everything up, knowing it would be hard for their families and friends to understand. They often used alcohol to numb the pain. This includes Don Malarkey, who spent decades struggling with PTSD, only to find some healing after he began to attend Easy Company reunions decades later and reconnect with the men. For Lewis Nixon, he already had a problem with alcohol before and during the war, and from Winters' account, the problem persisted after they returned home. As Damian Lewis's character states at the end of the series, it's true that Nixon had some tough times after the war. Lewis Nixon's divorce from his first wife, Catherine, was finalized in December 1945. The grounds for the divorce are revealed on his June 1946 affidavit for a marriage license that was filled out before he married his second wife, the English-born Irene Miller, who was 5 years his junior. Interestingly, the document states that Lewis and Catherine divorced due to incompatibility. However, the word incompatibility is crossed out and the word drunkenness is written above it. On their actual marriage license, the word drunkenness appears as the reason for his divorce from his previous wife, Catherine. However, as we know from Winters' statements about Lewis and Catherine not being in love and Catherine just wanting his family's money, in Winters' opinion, it seems that incompatibility and drunkenness were both accurate reasons for the divorce. On an interesting side note, in episode 5 of Band of Brothers, titled Crossroads, Lewis Nixon hands Richard Winters a 48-hour pass to go to Paris. Nixon tells Winters that he's heading back to Aldbourne, England, to look up a certain young lady. Though she is not mentioned by name, the young lady being referred to here is Irene Miller, who would become Nixon's second wife. She lived in Swindon, about a 20-minute drive from Aldbourne. He began seeing her during the war while he was still married to Catherine. Like a number of other details included in the series, it's an interesting one to notice after learning more about Lewis Nixon's history. Lewis and his English wife Irene married in June 1946 at Manhattan City Hall. Richard Winters was present for the occasion. Lewis and Irene were together for 15 years until they separated in the fall of 1961. However, they did not divorce at this time. It's likely that Lewis's drinking was a factor for the separation, and it has been speculated that there may have been arguments over Lewis Nixon's inheritance from his father, Stanhope Nixon, who had died in 1958. Instead of keeping most of his share of the money for himself and Irene, Lewis wanted the bulk of the money to go to his son from his first marriage, Michael, who was now an adult. After the lawsuit settled, Lewis got his wish and the bulk of the money went to Michael, who appears to have been living under the same roof as Lewis and Irene at the time, which certainly could have made the situation awkward and put an even deeper strain on Lewis and Irene's marriage. In the fall of 1961, shortly after he separated from Irene, Lewis Nixon began dating Grace Umezawa, a native of Southern California, who was 3 years his junior. However, Lewis and Grace did not marry until about 8 years later, tying the knot in Nevada on March 19, 1969, when Lewis was 50. Despite both the series and Richard Winters' memoir incorrectly stating that they married in 1956. Lewis's second wife Irene died on February 2, 1969, at the young age of 46, and despite being separated from Lewis for years, they remained legally married. After Irene passed away, Lewis married Grace Umezawa the following month. It's possible that he waited out of loyalty to Irene, especially if he knew she was sick. It's also possible he was happy with his arrangement with Irene and had wanted to avoid an ugly divorce. However, according to Richard Winters, Irene was a good woman, and Lewis knew that. She'd been there for him through some of the toughest times of his life. This included his mother passing in 1948 and his father passing a decade later. She was also there for him when his sister Blanche tragically passed away at age 31. According to Lewis, Blanche had battled depression for some time, and she removed herself from the world with a gun in 1955. It happened when she, Lewis, and Irene were staying in her San Francisco home. Lewis's wife, Irene, discovered her sister-in-law unresponsive in bed in the morning. The San Francisco Chronicle reported that Blanche's fortune of over $1,872,000 was willed to her brother Lewis. It's striking how much Blanche looked like a female version of her brother. Here, she is pictured in 1941 at age 18. I can't imagine how difficult this period must have been for Lewis, losing his mother, father, and sibling all in a span of 10 years. It was also during this period that Richard Winters left Nixon Nitration Works. Irene had been there for Lewis through it all. Credit for unearthing this information about Irene does not go to me. It goes to the Tumblr account Winix85, who spent more than a year researching Lewis Nixon's life and obtained corroborating documents and newspaper articles. I'll link to this source in the description. It's definitely worth reading. Something else incorrect that I've seen mentioned is that Richard Winters was the best man at Lewis and Grace's wedding. This seems to stem from an incorrect statement made on Wikipedia that has no source. Winters never mentions that he was the best man in his memoir, and if he wasn't at the wedding, it might explain more easily why he got the date wrong. It's also possible that Winters lied about the wedding date to protect Lewis, who was still married to Irene while living with Grace for a number of years. As Damian Lewis's character tells us at the end of the series, when Lewis Nixon married Grace, everything came together for him. She is also credited with helping him get over his addiction to alcohol. Winters stated in his memoir, until Lewis met and married Grace, he had never found or experienced true love. It was only after his marriage to Grace that he found true happiness, peace within himself. Together they traveled to just about every corner of the world and shared many wonderful experiences together. Grace's own life story is worthy of a movie itself. Her life had been turned upside down during World War II, and her response to that adversity is nothing short of inspiring. She was a trained cellist and had been a music major at San Diego State University in 1942 when her studies were interrupted by President Roosevelt's executive order authorizing the internment of Japanese Americans. Told to bring only what they could carry, Grace and her family were taken to Santa Anita Racetrack and housed in converted horse stalls. To keep her spirits up, she recalled dancing the jitterbug at Santa Anita with her sister Dorothy and some cute boys from Pasadena. Grace and her family were then sent to the Colorado River Relocation Center, an internment camp in Arizona. To escape the unhappiness of life in the camp, Grace seized an opportunity to become a nurse. She was permitted to leave the camp due to the fact that the government considered becoming a nurse an act of loyalty to her country in wartime. She studied at the Mayo Clinic and worked at a VA hospital in Brooklyn. She also became a flight attendant with Northwest Airlines, a job that at the time required a nursing certificate. She did this in part to work international flights in order to visit her elderly grandfather in Japan, who she had never met before. Eventually, Grace decided to move back to the West Coast, working at a VA hospital in Los Angeles. She continued to play the cello and embrace her love for music. As emphasized by Richard Winters and others who knew them, Lewis and Grace are said to have shared a loving and happy life together, whether they were traveling the world and visiting places like South Africa, Tibet, China, and Japan, or relaxing in their home in Sherman Oaks, California, listening to music and raising their various pets. Their furry family members included Anubis the cat, Nicholas the one-eyed dog, and Peter the rabbit. They also fed a neighborhood of family raccoons and the migrating Mr. and Mrs. Duck who returned each year. Though Lewis and Grace had no children together, they enjoyed spending time with their nieces and nephews. There were also 2 grandchildren by way of Lewis's son Michael from his first marriage. According to Richard Winters, Grace's sentiment about her husband in letters and Christmas cards was always the same. Lewis is so brave, he never complains. He always has a smile for me whenever I come into his room, and that just makes it all worthwhile. Lewis Nixon was far from a perfect person. At times, other veterans have described him as blasé, an alcoholic, and according to Buck Compton, who shared a particular distaste for him, a prick. Nixon was a man who certainly had his share of faults, as we all do, but he also had the courage to put on the uniform and was ready to give his life for his country. If anything, his intelligence and bravery are understated in Band of Brothers. During the war, Lewis Nixon had more schooling than most men around him, and this undoubtedly contributed to his skill at planning and operations, which he continually demonstrated throughout the war. His ability was recognized by Colonel Robert Sink, commander of the 506th. Richard Winters stated of his friend Lewis Nixon, "Captain Lewis Nixon and I were together every step of the way from D-Day to Berchtesgaden, May 8, 1945, VE Day. I still regard Lewis Nixon as the best combat officer who I had the opportunity to work with under fire. He never showed fear, and during the toughest times, he could always think clearly and quickly." Not long after parachuting into Normandy on D-Day, Nixon was handed a map of German artillery positions that had been discovered by Richard Winters. Realizing its importance, Nixon ran 3 miles to Utah Beach to send the map up the chain of command. Command was so impressed that they sent 2 tanks to assist the 101st. And like in the series, Nixon hitched a ride back. In the Netherlands, he was nearly killed when a bullet fired from a German MG-42 machine gun went through his helmet and grazed his forehead, leaving a brown burn mark without breaking the skin. Nixon was also one of only a few men in the 506th to earn 3 stars on their jump wings. He jumped into combat twice with the 506th, in Normandy and Market Garden, and he jumped once with General William Miley's 17th Airborne Division when he was asked to be an observer during Operation Varsity. During that jump, Nixon was assigned to be the jump master. The plane he was on took a direct hit from heavy anti-aircraft fire. Because he was close to the door, he was one of only 4 men who narrowly made it out, with the rest losing their lives when the plane crashed. In Richard Winters' memoir, he recalled a moment in Bastogne when Lewis Nixon won a month's leave to the U.S. He had his name drawn from a hat in a lottery that would give him a 30-day leave to the United States, said Winters. Nix refused the offer, saying he wanted to stay with the outfit on the line. How do you explain that kind of dedication? Such devotion is never discussed by the men, but it is never forgotten. Lewis Nixon died of complications from type 2 diabetes in Los Angeles, California on January 11, 1995, at age 76. His friend Richard Winters gave the eulogy at the request of Lewis's wife Grace. Also in attendance were veterans Clarence Hester and Bob Brewer. Grace Nixon would live for another 2 decades. On behalf of her late husband, she got to witness the release of the series, and she accompanied Dick and Ethel Winters to various events celebrating Easy Company and Band of Brothers. At the premiere, she sat next to actor Ron Livingston. Grace had even appeared in Ron Livingston's Band of Brothers video diary, attending a get-together before he left for actor boot camp.
Oh, that's a good picture.
Handsome.
I think so too.
This guy was handsome.
Yeah.
This is a handsome guy.
Oh, well, you I don't know. I think Lewis might be a little more handsome.
Winters credited Grace's love and care as being what had kept his best friend alive for so many years. Grace Nixon passed away at age 94 on January 16, 2016. Richard Winters once said of Lewis Nixon, "By the time we jumped into Holland, I was so lonely that I needed someone in whom I could confide my inner thoughts. That someone was Nix. Nixon was always there for me. He became a guy I could check with to receive counsel or a suggestion. Nixon kept me from second-guessing myself. Whenever the bullets began to fly, I could turn, and there stood Nix. He always walked on my left side, 1 or 2 steps behind me. This was his token of respect for me as a commander. In hindsight, Nix probably needed me as much as I needed him." If you want to learn more about Captain Lewis Nixon and his fellow Band of Brothers, check out the videos linked on the screen. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Anchors away, my friends.